This is a sort of the central event of the day in many ways, and I feel very privileged to be moderating it. We have a very distinguished panel here, slightly smaller than we'd anticipated, but even more distinguished by concentration, as it were, to discuss the issue of the powers of arts and culture to promote democracy and global peace. So a splendidly heavyweight subject. What struck me as this conference has proceeded is how little time you in the audience have had to ask questions. So the way I'd like to conduct this, and I haven't warned the panel of this, I'll introduce them in a minute, is I'd like them to speak for sort of 5 minutes max each to the subject, say one or two contentious things, which will take us half of our time. We have approaching an hour. And then it's down to you guys to offer challenging observations and questions for the panel to respond to. Well, we're all very happy to proceed in that way. Do I see nodding heads? Do I see nodding heads up here as well? Right, very good. Now the panel consists of, many of them you've met before, he's not here, the Erna Schoepges, who is European MP, former Luxembourgian Minister of Culture and Religious Affairs, Professor Mark Aspinwall, just on, he almost got off the stage and is now back, Professor of Politics at Edinburgh University. I'm afraid the panel is full of Brits, or approximate Brits, I suppose is what you are. I'm a Brit now. Yeah, well, approximate Brits. Professor John Hobson from Sheffield University, also Professor of Politics. Professor Doctor, yes, you're all Professor Doctors, of course. Yeah. Professor Dr. Sjaak Koenis. Yes.
Dutch thing, yeah.
Professor of Social Philosophy at Maastricht University. And last, but by no means least, Mark Domfried, who needs no introduction at all, but is the animating genius, of course, of the Institute of Culture and Diplomacy. I'm going to go from right to left in accordance with my political prejudices. So, John, would you like to launch off with your 5 minutes?
Okay. I'll confess
you have a microphone.
Yeah, of course.
Well, can you hear me now? Yeah. I'll confess I've not thought this through at all, as I was rather hoping that, as Tony said, that this would be something, a sort of a moment where you could ask me questions. But just thinking off the top of my head, and in typical provocative mode, but arts and culture, that's what we do on Saturday night, right? But culture's something that doesn't just happen on Saturday night, it happens all the time. Culture infuses our everyday lives. Culture's what gives meaning to them. It's what we do all the time. It's infused with our work, our thinking, everything. And so, you know, I don't wish in any way to denigrate the importance of the arts and music and so on. That has its place. But I just want to, I guess at this point, try and open the discussion up beyond that, not to exclude that, but to think more broadly about the way different cultures interact. And so I guess it comes back to what I was talking about in my talk, sort of this intercultural diplomacy, you know. If you take it at that broader level, it's not going to be simply Ian Gillan goes to Israel or wherever. It's going to be how different societies from around the world talk to each other and understand each other. And sure, music and films and all the rest of it can do that, but I think it goes much deeper than that. One of the forms of intercultural diplomacy that I always have in mind, actually, was the whole decolonization process, whereby, you know, the nationalist elites, there was violence, true, but that wasn't what really brought the empire to an end. It was, in effect, intercultural diplomacy. It was nationalist movements saying to the Western imperial nations, look, you claim to stand for human rights and democracy and freedom for all and that dreaded word tolerance. But in fact, you give us none of those things. And of course, it coincided with racism, which Adolf Hitler had given a very bad name to. And the Western countries had finally felt what it was to feel like when you're on the end of that. So that helped bring about the end of empire. Not a small achievement, I might add, a moment of what I'd call significant Eastern agency. So it's getting parts of the world to talk to each other and to understand each other. That, for me, is what intercultural diplomacy is. I mean, we can have intercultural diplomacy within Europe, of course, but I tend to see that as intracultural diplomacy. It's a very similar group of people under the same umbrella, but so that's why I'm always talking about this East-West thing. So really all I'm trying to do in my increasingly limited time left is to think a little bit beyond just the politics of pop music and culture and the arts, important though they are. Thank you.
Thank you. Mark?
Yes, thanks. I guess I would start by I think maybe expanding a little bit on what I was saying before, that as academics we're professional skeptics, and if the question was about the power of culture and the arts to divide and to cause global conflict and war, then I would be thinking of examples of the opposite, how they bring people together, and so I'm trying to balance out what I sense is a kind of a commonly held view about their positive effects, which I want to believe in and I hope is right. But I was talking to somebody a couple of nights ago about I think it was in 1989 when the United States government under the first George Bush decided it had to go get Manuel Noriega, who was the then leader of Panama. I don't know how many of you remember this incident. Went down there, and Noriega fled into an embassy. Now, if I'm not mistaken, it was the embassy of the Vatican in Panama, and there he was holed up. And the U.S. military stopped outside and said, well, they checked with Washington. We can't go in because that's against international law. Here we are, camped out outside. Listen, I tell you what we do. We'll turn up the music to volume 11. I think maybe I mentioned this the other day. Did I mention this? And this eventually, rock music at full volume flushed Noriega out after a while. Now I don't know whether that was American music or music from maybe Metallica, maybe it was Black Sabbath or Deep Purple, but that eventually got him out. Now that's use of culture or music in a way that was seen as not very good. And Ian Gillan was talking about his experience with long hair in Malaysia. The presence of certain kinds of culture, of pop music, of rebellious, of the Sex Pistols in the 1970s. They can foment rebellion. They can foment new ways of thinking, and this can create divisions and difficulties between those in power and those who are rebelling against that or want to make statements against that in a way that's perceived as threatening. Later on, of course, then. Like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, they become part of the establishment, and their errant ways are part of folklore. They're treasured in a way. They become positive things rather than negative things. So over time, of course, attitudes can change toward the arts and culture in ways that make them more positive. I think I'm going to say this again. I think that the way to promote, that we're promoting democracy and global peace probably is most effectively through material incentives. Some of them hard power and others not hard power but material. Now, there's another academic at Harvard, what was at Harvard and is at Princeton now, named Andrew Moravcsik, who's been very influential in the study of the European Union, and who said something very interesting, which actually I agree with very much. He said, look, the US tried to change regimes, promote democracy and peace in the Middle East by invading Iraq and Afghanistan. Incredibly costly in a lot of different kinds of ways. The EU, by contrast, promoted peace and did regime change by encouraging Eastern European countries to join. Much less costly and much more effective. And the basic incentives for these Eastern and Central European countries were material ones, the ones of material benefits through memberships, in a certain sense security ones as well, but that was satisfied more by NATO. So I think these probably are initially the most important ones, and culture can play a role, a supplementary role, one of which reinforces identity, a Western civilizational identity in which the EU countries feel at one or feel unified. And I think is important, but probably much more supplementary. So I'm going to draw it to a close there, and I'll pass along.
Thank you, Minister Schoepges. As one of the few non-academics on this panel.
I'm a politician. I'm not an academic, but I'm a practitioner, and I'm an artist. That's my profession. I'm a pianist. So I oppose to what you said, that culture in the Eastern countries was not a very big reason, as now the OECD is changing the ruling of calculating GDP and including the development of culture and education, and so probably GDP in the Eastern countries will increase, whereas perhaps it will decrease in the West. But let us have a look at this sentence, and let's replace all the words by their opposite. What is peace? The contrary of peace is aggression. Maybe aggression of a member state, maybe aggression of a single person. So, thus, culture and arts promote peace or aggression. Well, sometimes it's aggression. That depends on which expression of culture it is. But many times it's peace. And it's peace at the interior of the single person. And so if we are going further, democracy, the contrary of democracy, could be totalitarianism. Culture and totalitarianism have for sure had an history during communism. And after the finished period of the communism, you saw that culture and mainly also religion, all the expressions that were forbidden, they were there. They had not died. So culture and the expression of ideas and of values has survived in spite of no democracy. How can arts and culture promote democracy? I think democracy is in a great danger, and I think the democratic crisis in the European member states is particularly to be looked at very seriously, as we have participations in elections, something like 20% for European elections. It's very low. So if people are no longer participating, is there still democracy? So I think culture and arts are one way to promote the education and the level of the values of the citizens. To promote democracy, there is something else needed. There is information needed, there is the press needed, there is of course a lot of well-informed citizens, and well-trained citizens are needed to have a really democracy.
Thank you very much. Dr. Koenis.
Yeah, sorry. I already had so much time to put to you my position about democracy, so I'm not going to repeat it. Just to say maybe one comment about how fascinated I am by, let's say, the words that we find most important, like democracy, like culture, are also the words that we probably find the hardest to define and to sort of make clear what we mean by it. And maybe this double-edged point that I tried to make about democracy also holds true for the notion of culture. There's many circumstances in which I think we should value cultural differences, where it is good to learn others' ways, etc. So all these rosy notions about cultural diversity are positive, but there is also many circumstances which I would claim it is better not to talk about culture, or maybe just to realize that apart from having a culture or a cultural background, we are individuals trying to, for instance, be together in a nation or be together in Europe. And I would like to make this point that these double edge, which should not be forgotten. There are circumstances in which maybe culture is something that we just take along, keep on our backs, but just don't explicate too much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mark.
Thank you very much. I wish that I had a semester to answer this question. It's such a huge topic, but I really want to hear your questions, so I'll limit my response to maximum 4 minutes. Let's cut this question in half. Promoting democracy. As much as I love democracy, I actually don't think democracy should be promoted. I think democracy needs to come organically, very naturally from within. The desire has to be from within. And I would say, my own position, it shouldn't be something that we push on people. It shouldn't be something that should be promoted. So that's my personal opinion regarding promoting democracy. I could expand on that much more, but I won't for now. I want to come to the second point, global peace. I think that cultural diplomacy and the arts and culture can promote global peace. However, we need to distinguish what kind of cultural diplomacy we're talking about. There are 3 categories for cultural diplomacy that I'd like to distinguish now. 2 of them I don't think really promote peace. One of them has the possibility to promote peace. One, let's say, school of cultural diplomacy is much of what we've seen in the 20th century as we look at the British councils, the Goethe Institutes, the Alliances Françaises, which was primarily a cultural diplomacy about winning the hearts and minds of foreign audiences, primarily a cultural diplomacy about persuading, primarily a cultural diplomacy about actually bringing our cultures abroad or somehow presenting them to other audiences. I have nothing against that, although I don't think that's really a way to promote peace. That's a way maybe to present your country, maybe to present your culture. You know, fine. I have nothing against that. Send your jazz musicians, have your Goethe Institutes, great. But I don't think that's really going to be a vehicle to build peace. That's really more of a one-way street. A second school for cultural policy or cultural diplomacy would be sometimes what I refer to as negative cultural diplomacy, in the sense of cultural diplomacy that's more about blocking, more about protecting, more about preserving. And again, I love UNESCO. I have nothing against UNESCO's attempt to preserve culture and cultural artifacts, but I don't think that's going to help promote peace. I have nothing against the French, who have very high quotas on the radio, limiting the amount of music that can be in other languages. I think that's a legitimate response to a very unfair globalization, which does make it difficult for cultures to compete, which does make it difficult. For example, when I came to Germany, it was so hard for me to listen to German music. I would turn on the radio and look and look and look. You have American music and Italian and French and everything. It was difficult. So again, I have nothing against the idea of also trying to protect a culture or even having limits, such as quotas on the radio, but that's also not going to bring peace. So I would say have your quotas, respond to globalization as you need, no problem. But again, that's not going to help bring peace. By making it more difficult for certain flows to take place, that won't bring peace. But it might be an appropriate way of preserving your language or your culture. The third category of cultural diplomacy that I'd like to distinguish for you, I think does have the possibility for promoting peace. And this is a cultural diplomacy that's much more about input than it is output, much more about listening than it is about speaking. The foreign minister of Mozambique once told me, God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. We need to listen more. And in that sense, he was saying for diplomacy, it's vital. Don't say anything. Go and listen. Give respect to that culture. Listen to that culture. Hear what stories they have to tell. And then you're going to build trust. Then you have a chance to build understanding. You don't even have to speak at all. And I think even though this may seem like a radical idea for culture diplomacy, I think there's a lot of logic there. What if instead of telling America's story to the world, we were listening to the world's stories for America? What if instead of actively promoting and investing money to bring our cultures abroad, we use that same money to bring other cultures to us? What about instead of the State Department writing on Facebook pages and sending tweets, they were reading Facebook pages and they were reading tweets and they were listening, for example, to the hip-hop music of Cairo in Egypt before the Arab Spring. If they were looking at the Egyptian movies, if they were reading the Egyptian books, if they were looking at the graffiti on the walls in cities and streets in Cairo, we could have seen the Arab Spring coming. We could have had a much closer analysis, a much closer, let's say, our ear to the street, so to speak, in terms of what's happening. That's a useful strategic thing for governments, and I think it's also a way of really building trust, building understanding. So I'd love to hear your views on this and maybe debate it in the context of the panel, but I think that kind of cultural diplomacy, we haven't seen so much of it yet, but I think could be very, very interesting. And it's a challenge because you have to articulate to countries and to institutions how they can also benefit. Why should they be doing this? But I think it'd be very, very interesting if governments as well as NGOs would really do more of that, really facilitate access between peoples and cultures, listen more, and really put an emphasis, even if it means investing funds and resources, to allow for that listening to take place, especially in parts of the world where there's sometimes no listening going on. So I'll stop there, but I think in that category of culture diplomacy, I could see a chance to maybe achieve global peace or at least assist in that process. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Mark. Happily, we have a late addition to the panel in the form of Professor Pecican. Am I pronouncing that right?
Excellent, yes.
Babes-Bolyai University in Cluj, a city I know well, I have to say. without any warning at all, you're invited to speak for 5 minutes on the subject under discussion, which is the power of the arts and culture to promote democracy and global peace. Please,
Thank you very much. I think I'll finish in 3 minutes, as usually. But what I wanted to say is, by personal example, I am the product of the belief that culture really matters in a diplomatic way. And I shall give you my small story about myself. Sorry for looking bad because I speak about me. But I really wanted, when studying history, to write it otherwise, that in the times of the unique party, the Communist Party, it was always about our medieval princes, it was always about court life, and so on. I was pretty much interested in how people used to live. Maybe also because I read a lot of French history. You know, Nouvelle Histoire is specialized in economic history, cultural history, mentalities, how they call them in French. Emmanuel Durand-Ladurie, tous les autres, the others, historians. So I tried to write the history of the Romanians going down at the basic level of the society. And I discovered wonderful things, and it was pretty much a success. And I think that because I used also, obviously, the comparative approach, that was interesting also for the other people from the region, because I spoke also about Hungarian cuisine in Transylvania. I spoke about how our ancestors used, to steal the girls and go with them in the woods, in spite of decently ask their hands from the parents, and so on. So everything became immediately so interesting and unpredictable, because otherwise a prince came because he was the inheritor of his father and mother, and then he has his followers, etc., etc. So I think that step by step you can, using this wonderful and very powerful, I must say, tool that is namely the culture, you can create a space for cultural diplomacy. It's not only about writing in your ivory tower about an argument, but also speaking with your colleagues, and through your colleagues with their students, and then with your students, with other categories of cultivated public. So step by step you create an atmosphere. And this is fantastically important, because if you create it, debates are immediately possible. And after debating, you have some results. Maybe not the best at the beginning, but step by step, the solutions come. So I would say this is my personal example. I look like a wild, a wild historian in my country, because it's not the official history we used to have. Still we used to have, because after the communists, we had some continuations on the nationalist version, and I think all the people from the Balkan area and maybe also the other parts of, let's say, Central Europe understand exactly what I say. So I think it's very, very important what kind of history you teach in your schools, because I think yesterday someone discussed about this huge problem, how to put together the version of history of the Croats, Serbians, Bosnian, Herzegovinians, and the others. That's a specific and very special task. I think it was solved by the French and Germans together, but now it's our turn. We don't live on islands. We live together there. So I trust culture. That's my life. I said it already. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm the moderator here, so I'm not really allowed an opinion, but there is one, I'm going to throw one thought into the mix, a thought which, given what Mark's just said, almost guarantees that I will never be invited again, which goes as follows. I'm an ex-diplomat, but at the moment I live in Cambridge University, so I know the academic environment a little bit. And what I hear there and what I hear in a lot of other British, and I'm sure more widely academic environments, is a certain querulousness about spreading Western values. about the virtues of democracy is the thing that I'm particularly focused on, about it somehow being neo-imperialist for us to go out and persuade, sometimes compel, other countries to buy on to our sort of political system. And I have to say I have very little sympathy with that line of thought. I come from the city where the law of gravity was discovered, actually. And of course, it's not Cambridge's law of gravity. It's a universal law, happened to be discovered in Cambridge, but it works everywhere. And I think the same happens for other bits of individual cultural advance and discovery, that they work everywhere. And I think this particularly strongly, and this perhaps reflects my most recent diplomatic posting, which was in Russia, this particularly applies to the importance of democracy and the importance of the West shrugging off fears of being accused of neo-imperialism and all the rest, and getting out there and selling this value because it's good for everyone. I simply throw that in to infuriate, no doubt, Mark, others around the room, but as part of the background for our discussion. The floor, you'll be relieved to hear, is now open. So I invite you, as you stand up, could you say who you are, and could you say who you would like to address your question? Please, over there at the floor.
Hi. Yeah, everyone knows my name by now, I believe. I'm Janine. And yes, you did infuriate me, so well done for that. Because I just want to ask, who said that the Western values are the best? Who said they're good? Who said that they are supposed to be spread? Who said that values of other countries, their own traditional methods of, I don't know, governance, organization, making peace, are worse? And if we look at the track record of my area of expertise, peace building, then, well, let's just say it failed. It failed badly. So, yeah, you infuriated me.
Nice. Can we take a couple more questions before we get into replies from the floor?
First, I'm going to do the cameraman's privilege right now. I've been biting the bullet a long time. Someone once said that art is higher than life. I don't know who that was, but maybe somebody that knows it. But I'm a filmmaker. And just about 3 or 4 years ago, there was a 24-hour reading of the Quran, the Hebrew Bible, and the Christian Bible, and I filmed it. And after the filming was done, we had to have the credits and everything. And so I had an idea, how do I introduce film? How do, what are going to be the first images they're going to see? And I was doing some research on cave-dwelling paintings, and I came across a very beautiful painting in a cave that must have been 30,000 years old. And so I used this image, and then something occurred to me. Then there was a program on Premiere which allowed for an image to give the semblance of letters falling from the image itself. So you see the hunt, and then you see these letters fall from the picture of the hunt into words, the Quran, the Holy Bible, and the Christian Bible. Culture is not a side issue. When we open our mouths to communicate or write something or music or whatever, we are exhibiting culture. It's an integral part of our existence. There is this urge to record, to remember what we've done and what we may do or what we're doing now. You can't put it on the side. It's impossible to do that. You're learned people, professors and doctors. You read, you write, you demonstrate our culture, period. There's no way around that. The discourse we're having here is a very vivid example of our cultural aspects. They cannot be separated from our existence. I've heard that. I've heard that here, and I think that, I know that is an error. As to the imperialism, anytime one section of this planet uses 80 to 90% of the resources at the detriment of the rest of the planet, they're going to have a hard time trying to convince people that they're doing the right thing. No amount of, I don't know, hedging the issue is going to, clear that up, So culture, to me, is an expression of our deep-rooted yearning to provide the next generations with a view, a concept of our existence. And we have many different cultures across the planet, but we do have more in common with each other than we do have differences. And I think we should remember that, and try to focus on the things that we have in common and discuss the things and discuss our differences. But once we stand on that ground that says, hey, we are together here, we have a common purpose, we have a common future, then I think things would be much better.
Thank you. He's a good preacher.
I noticed that the battery's going down, so just let me just change the battery. We're gonna.
Is there anyone who feels they can speak loud enough to do without a microphone for a minute?
Hello.
Please.
Yes, I have a question for every one of you. I want to. I see that you're very passionate about or going into the path of promoting democracy and global peace. So I'm interested, what has been the power of art in you, specifically for this issue? So I want you to, if you could tell me specifically, if you remember a piece of art, film, music, dance, that has inspired you or provoked you or moved you towards promoting democracy and global peace. I'm interested in knowing that. Thank you.
That's a very good basis to bring the panel in. Would you each like to offer a piece of culture?
Yeah, I have one.
Please, Professor.
May I? So the most inspiring, at least until now, for me was Karamazov Brothers by Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky, where the author asks, God exists if a kid can die without a cause, just like this. I think this struck me very much. Thank you.
I have no films to offer, but I will offer a response to Tony. I know he's itching for one. I think that he made his point with lots and lots of passion and lots of sincerity, none of which I doubt. The term imperialism, of course, is a loaded term, and it's used particularly on the left side of politics as an inherent pejorative. So if you can describe somebody as imperialist or Eurocentric, ipso facto, they've lost and you've won and that's it, game over. But imperialism doesn't have to imply economic conquest, economic exploitation, repression, genocide. In fact, I would argue, in its pure liberal form, particularly as it was articulated in the 19th century, and now again, especially after 1989, it's really about a civilizing mission. It's the idea that our values are inherently good, and our values are inherently superior to everybody else's. And if we're good people, then we have a duty, indeed what Kipling called a burden, because it's no fun, this empire bit. It costs lives, it costs money. But hey, we'll do it for the benefit of everybody, and we believe that we must do it, and we believe it will work because it's universal. Now, I don't doubt that democracy can be a good thing. I live in Britain. I enjoy democracy there. I've got no gripes. I'm not anti-democratic. I'm just not so convinced that it's this inherent universal that the West believes that it is. That's not to say it's not a good thing. I'm not denying that for a moment. But to pick up on Mark's point, it would be nice instead of preaching and telling others that they should have the latest thing that Western civilization has come up with, and democracy is a pretty recent thing in the West. It didn't begin in ancient Greece. Most countries weren't democratic in Europe until well into the 20th century. The USA, not until after 1965. These are late times. And now we're born again democratic preachers, and we're going to preach to the world, and we're going to tell them that this is what they need. Many may benefit from it. That is very possible. My point would be simply to say that if that's what other peoples want, that's up to them. But I'm not convinced that we should go around and bomb them into submission until they finally develop it, or just somehow force them. Now, that might be unfair, because Tony was saying that, you know, we should persuade them. There was no discussion of high-level strategic bombing from 35,000 feet, or, God forbid, tanks or infantry where people's lives could be lost. But I still think we need to listen. We don't actually know that much about how other societies develop their polities. Africa, there's just a black hole. It's full of failed states, collapsed states, tyrannical states. Is it? I mean, is it really? How do they actually live their lives? And there is politics there that doesn't conform to these stereotypes. So all I'm saying is, maybe we could listen. If the Middle East wants to embrace democracy and can do it, fine, great. But I don't think we have a right to force it upon them. Forcing something, especially through the barrel of a gun, tends to backfire both on the person using it and doesn't help necessarily the person against which it is aimed. And that's it.
On the last question, I would, although it never inspired me to go out and press for global peace, I think the documentaries of Werner Herzog are absolutely brilliant. The White Diamonds, the cave paintings one, and others, and the Grizzly Man, because you see a person making a documentary, Werner Herzog, who has an unbelievably acute sense of of how to get to the real issue at the core of what he's filming, and he asks the most brilliant questions. And he's a sensitive, careful filmmaker with I think a really good sense. I would just recommend this in a way because I learned so much about the world just by watching his documentaries. Now, democracy. My turn. I actually agree with Mark as well. I don't think.
Sorry, I said this.
I don't.
want this to be about me.
No. I actually think democracy is a really important and a good thing, but not for the same reasons. And I agree with Mark. I think it has. If it gets put in place without a culture behind it, in which. And the culture is this. The culture is that if I come from a particular ethnic group or social group, and the political representative of the other ethnic or social group gets elected to power, I want to be sure that he's going to look after or she's going to look after my interests, and they're not going to cut me out, cut down the resources, persecute me or whatever. Without that culture of power sharing, that understanding by which it's okay for somebody else to hold power for a while, then democracy won't work. But also, democracy is held up as an ideal, and actually, I mean, this is a kind of extension of what I was saying in my talk. Democracy is expected to solve things that it can't solve anymore, because as a globe, we're increasingly entangled by agreements that standardize and regulate what we can do in our economic and social lives. We have that within states as well, but it's increasingly crossing borders. So a democratically elected politician who promised in the campaign to do X, Y, and Z finds that she cannot do that. Why? Because the country has already entered into agreements with the European Union or with the WTO, or has some kind of, there are private international law agreements that restrict what that country can do. We move through democracy. Democracy is not the end point. The end point is standardization, harmonization, and regulation. That's where we actually solve the problems that democracy, people think that democracy is solving. It's not. So elected politicians come to power and they find, well,